Newcastle upon Tyne is famous for many things. Its bridges, nightlife and being the birthplace of Greggs are just some of them. We've seen plenty of world firsts here, been on the front line of science and technology in past centuries, witnessed ethical consumption in the 18th century, and even turned a Roman settlement into a thriving city. But our disasters are perhaps less well known. Yes, many people have heard of the Great Plague and the Great Fire that throttled London in 1665 and 1666 respectively. Some of you might even know about the 1928 Thames flood or the deadly Great Smog of 1952, also both in London. But Newcastle has also suffered from plague, fire, flood and cholera, among other things. Why don't we hear about these as often, if at all? Let's explore the Great Plague of 1636, the Great Flood of 1771 and the Great Fire of 1854 to see what they can tell us about the city we might encounter here in the 2020s. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. First of all, I will say Happy New Year. We are now into 2026 and in a couple of weeks' time, the podcast turns 7, so that's exciting. And yeah, I hope you had a good New Year. I hope you had a good Christmas. I hope you enjoyed the festive folklore episodes last month where some podcasting pals came in to help me out. We are back into the usual format of podcast episodes for the foreseeable future, where I will be sharing stuff in a somewhat excitable fashion that I've found that I think you might like. But this is going to be a slightly different theme for January, because what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the history of a city, or history in a city, I should say, and how that then links to folklore, how it then contains folk traditions, but also how it plays out in terms of how we can connect with place. And obviously folklore is all about place. Well, I would argue so is local history. And you might wonder why we're looking at a city's history if we're looking at folklore. And folklore isn't just pithy sayings or rustic charms. And I know there has been a tendency, particularly on social media, where a lot of the folklore content does tend towards this idea of getting out into nature, running round stone circles, that kind of thing. And while that's all fine and that's all grand and obviously part of folklore, cities do get eternally overlooked. And this has been a problem since people began collecting folklore, so this is not a new problem at all. In fact, it's a feature, not a bug. And as Owen Davies explained when I interviewed him a little while ago on Fabulous Folklore Presents, the collectors thought that people were too canny and streetwise in cities, so if you wanted folk wisdom, you would have to go to rural areas to find it. And it is a bit of a forerunner to the same romanticisation of the past and the old ways and the rural environment that we see in folkloric preoccupations now. But here's the thing, people continue to practice traditions and superstitions wherever they are, even in cities. Especially in cities, I would argue. Look at all the European cities that I've gathered legends and ghost stories from. Many of them have particular places where you go to perform a particular ritual for a particular thing. Even if it's something like rubbing part of a statue, or if it's going to a particular place and performing a particular action, like people leaving Lenormand decks on Madame Lenormand's grave in Père Lachaise in Paris in order to help boost their divinatory powers and so on. These are all still folklore and they all still happen in cities. So if folklore is the lore of the folk, then you get a lot of folk in cities. It's almost concentrated, you might say. And yes, you don't really get the same legends of the good folk necessarily, but you'll still find folk remedies, legends, and ghosts in particular. So you do still find a lot of folklore in cities. You can also find folklore within local history, where apocryphal stories often become part of the legend when facts fall away. And I first encountered, for example, stories of the Newcastle plague via stories told on a ghost walk, where the traditions were actually all that remained in order to paint a picture of that particular time. Now, I've picked Newcastle for this series because A, I live here, B, I'm on a bit of a quest to share as much of northern history and folklore as I can, and indeed have been since the beginning of doing all of this. I mean, my very first blog post way back in 2016 about folklore was about Newcastle's vampire rabbit. And C, I was really struck by the words of E.J. Gilbert, who poses the question, and I quote, "Why is it a local history when it's about the North, but when it's about London, it's not a local history?" End quote. So I do think that it's important to bear in mind places other than London, quite frankly. London's awesome, I love the place, don't get me wrong, but for our purposes we are going to have a look at Newcastle. But when you are done reading this article, what you can then do, hopefully, is go and find out stuff about your town or city's history, and then also have a look to see what that tells you about its folklore. So hopefully this will inspire you to go and have a look at where you live to see what you can find as well. And that is how we then preserve these stories and keep these legends and so on going. So that's generally my gist for this particular series of episodes. So we are going to start off with the disasters of Newcastle, but I will say that for future episodes we're also going to be having a look at things like the Bladen races, which you may or may not be familiar with if you're from outside of the northeast. We will also be having a look at a music hall performer who dovetails with a lot of folk music, and he's not really very well known outside the northeast at all. But I also realise I don't really cover much folk music on the podcast, so I thought that would be quite a good opportunity to do that. I haven't decided what the other two episodes will be yet, but I'm going to try and look at obviously the more light-hearted stuff if I can. So hopefully that'll give you an idea. Now, in terms of the disasters, I'm not covering the Newcastle witch trials for the simple reason that I already have that wonderful chat with Dave Silk on Fabulous Folklore Presents. He goes into the witch trials in far greater depth than I ever can. I have also covered the witch trials themselves in the Town Moor episode, so that's another good example of how part of a city's history preserves part of its folk calendar and so on. And obviously I've got an episode on the Geordie dialect, and there's the one where I followed the route of the Lortburn. Like, I've done quite a lot of history meets folklore stuff in Newcastle before, so that's generally what we're going to start off with. But while I've called the episode Fire, Flood and Plague, we're actually going to do them in the opposite order, because Fire, Flood and Plague sounded better, but then they're not in chronological order. So we're going to go in chronological order just because it satisfies the way my brain works. So we're going to start off with the 1636 plague. And many of you will know about Europe's Black Death pandemic of 1348 to 1349, London's Great Plague of 1665, or you'll have heard of things like the influenza pandemic of 1919. And we've all lived through a pandemic ourselves. In some ways, we are still living through a pandemic ourselves. But you probably haven't heard of the Newcastle plague. Plague had been a regular visitor to Newcastle, with especially bad outbreaks in 1369 and 1379. 2,000 people died from the plague in 1579, and given the population was around 10,000 at the time, that's 1 in 5 people died in a single outbreak. Another 1,700 people died in the 1589 outbreak, and by 1595 to 97, when there was another outbreak, people got so sick of the plague that they actually moved to makeshift camps at Barrisbridge, Spittletongues and St Anne's to try and get away from what was going on in the city. But it's the 1636 outbreak that we're going to deal with here, because it was so severe that Colonel John Fenwick wrote that Newcastle, and I quote, was almost desolate, the streets growing green with grass, the treasury wasted, the trading departed, end quote. And while Newcastle's 1636 plague didn't necessarily kill as many people as other outbreaks, it possibly killed a higher proportion of the population in a single community. So let's have a look at some figures to give you an idea of where I'm coming from with this. Historians think 5,631 people died of plague between 6th of May and early December in Newcastle in 1636. And that's 47% of the population, or roughly 1 in 2. That is a ridiculously high number of people by any type of measure that you might try to use. Surprisingly, 2 burial lists survived from the period, which helped to provide the data, and they also helped to track the spread of plague across the city, so we can see essentially where it came in and then how it spread across the rest of the city. Dr. Robert Jennison also published an account of the plague after it ended, helping to broaden the picture of the devastation caused by the disease. And the book has a typical 17th century title, and I've included it purely because of how long it is, but it was called Newcastle's Call to Her Neighbour and Sister Towns and Cities Throughout the Land to Take Warning by Her Sins and Sorrows, lest this overflowing scourge of pestilence reach even unto them also. I love 17th century book titles because they're just ridiculously long, and that is a good example of one. But anyway, so that gives you an idea of the figures. And it's not entirely clear how the plague got into Newcastle, but in 1833, John Sykes noted a belief that the plague entered North Shields first from Holland in October 1635 and then essentially made its way along the Tyne to Newcastle in May 1636. By comparison, John Grundy notes that the plague entered Newcastle in the parish of Sandgate on the river in May 1636. So we've got a really densely packed area. There's lots of mariners and other seafarers living here, very overcrowded, very poor sanitation in the area as well, massive middens in the area and things like that. So basically quite a horrible place to live. But the general assumption is that somehow an infected person ended up there, possibly arrived by boat, but that's where essentially it began. So the plague then moved west into the parish of St Nicholas, where it attacked the homes of rich merchants on Sandhill, and then it worked its way up into the parish of St Andrews near Newgate, but by the end of July the whole city was affected. Now, to give some context, Newcastle normally held around 50 funerals every month, but in May 1636 that figure was 50 a week. By the end of July, the 4 parishes were each burying 5 or 6 people a day, and on the 11th to the 13th of August, 400 people died. So again, by any measure, 400 people is a lot, but when your total population is only around about 10,000, that's a lot of people suddenly being removed from the community. Now, the authorities introduced quarantine regulations to try to contain the disease. So if someone in your household was found to be sick, the house was then boarded up, which is the kind of thing that we hear from places like the Great Plague and so on as well in London. And obviously no one could enter or leave. It was effectively a death sentence. So as one example, a man named John Collingwood died, but then so did his children and servants and the 3 girls who had been sent to him by their dying father. So you lost an entire household off the back of these quarantine regulations. You can understand what the quarantine regulations were for, but because they didn't really understand what was actually spreading the disease and how you could actually mitigate for it, that was obviously what helped to cause additional problems. Obviously, isolation in general is brilliant for airborne diseases, but in this particular case, keeping everybody together wasn't necessarily that helpful. We do have a lot of information about how people handled this from a solicitor named Ralph Taylor, and he made 91 wills for the dying, and he would sometimes stand on a ladder outside their window, sometimes he would sit on a wall outside their window and the person would dictate their will to him through the window, but he did also sometimes actually visit them. Somehow he avoided the plague himself, although there are some genetic quirks which do leave people actually immune to the plague. But he did take down the final wishes of those who would soon die. Now, sometimes he wasn't actually alone with the dying because a friend or neighbour might be present and they'd essentially broken the rules so that the person wasn't alone when they died. But Taylor made all of these different wills, and we could see how people's preoccupations were really quite ordinary to make sure that people were remembered, people got something in the will, and that essentially that their final wishes were hopefully going to be adhered to. By the summer, the authorities began moving the sick to isolation lodges on the town moor, and this was in a bid to isolate the sick rather than the entire household. And possibly surprisingly, when Taylor entered the houses of the dead to then create inventories for probate purposes, he actually found no evidence of looting, so any cash that had been left behind was still in place, food hadn't been stolen, and whether that's because criminals didn't want to enter plague houses or because the criminals had left or died themselves is obviously open to debate. Now, the plague no doubt contributed to the febrile atmosphere in the cities when authorities then sent for a witch finder in 1650, but where it also enters the folk tradition is because the impact of so much death was preserved in this idea that grass covered the streets and so few people used them. And that was the bit that I'd heard on the Ghost Walk, and I was obviously a bit concerned as to whether or not that was necessarily true or something that was added for dramatic effect, but I did actually find that tradition in 2 19th century sources, where the writer was preserving this idea that the streets were grown with grass because there weren't enough people using carts or walking to wear the grass away, basically. So I thought that was quite interesting how the idea of the plague was preserved in that one mental image of the city rather than in anything else. Obviously, that's the first disaster that we're going to cover. So we're now going to move on to flood, and this was 1771. And even if you've never set foot in Newcastle, you're probably aware of the bridges. Indeed, if you're watching on YouTube, the main image for this particular episode will have been one of my photos of the bridges. We do have several at this point, but the Tyne Bridge is perhaps the most obvious symbol, especially if you've ever watched the Great North Run on TV, because obviously people run across that and then the red arrows fly over. Now, that particular bridge only dates to the 1920s, and it was actually built to provide work for men returning from the First World War. So they knew that they needed a new bridge anyway, but it gave them a good opportunity to then put all these men back to work and then thus help avoid a recession. So that was quite helpful. The Tyne Bridge's predecessor was actually built in 1781, but that was after its predecessor, the medieval bridge, was swept away in a flood a decade earlier. Now, this medieval bridge is the one that we're talking about, and it's sometimes been compared to bridges like Florence's Ponte Vecchio, where buildings line the bridge across the River Arno. You've got something slightly similar with the Rialto Bridge in Venice, it's a lot smaller. Our Newcastle version featured houses and shops making the most of the extra quote-unquote land provided by the bridge. At the time of the Great Flood, the bridge was the only real solid crossing over the Tyne unless you wanted to use a ferry. The shops capitalised on passing trade, and a blue stone sat in the centre of the bridge to mark the boundary between Newcastle and Gateshead, but it also marked the boundary between Newcastle and County Durham. But on Sunday, 17th of November 1771, the horrendous rainfall the day before caused the Tyne to rise higher than usual, and at one point it rose 12 feet above the high water mark, and obviously the river burst its banks, flooding the cellars and ground floor premises from the close along to the Ouseburn. So if you are familiar with the quayside, that's quite a long stretch of quay, I think you'll agree, that will be affected by this. And the water on Sandhill was 6 feet deep. Sandhill is also where the Lochburn joins the Tyne. So if you remember that episode, that's the part of town where I'm talking about. It was a miracle, though, that the people who lived in the lower parts of the buildings actually escaped. So nobody died as a result of the flood on solid ground, which I think is absolutely brilliant. At least in Newcastle, there was more death and destruction up and down the Tyne, but in the actual Newcastle part, nobody died at that particular point, on the Newcastle side at least. But the force of the water swept away the middle arch of the Tyne Bridge and 2 arches at the Gateshead side, and the raging torrent destroyed 7 shops and then killed 6 of the people who lived on the bridge. So that was obviously where the loss of life occurred, on the bridge itself. And the flood actually washed away all of the bridges across the Tyne except the one at Corbridge. After the loss of the bridge, a ferry took people back and forward until a temporary timber bridge could be opened. Scottish architect Robert Milne designed a stone neoclassical replacement bridge which opened in 1781 and which was later widened by Robert Stevenson. But the stone bridge meant that only the keelmen could get up or down the river with coal, which made things a bit more difficult for William Lord Armstrong, who had industry along at Elsick and basically couldn't get things up or down the Tyne. So he designed and paid for the swing bridge, which opened in 1876. And as the name suggests, it swings on a central pivot to open, allowing ships to pass either side, which meant he could then start investing in shipbuilding up at his Elsick works. But I wanted to include the swing bridge because in terms of local folk tradition, my grandmother used to gather with other children to try and stay on the bridge when it swung open. So a ship would give 3 blasts on its horn as it was approaching the bridge, and then the bridge would obviously return the blasts to say, yes, we've heard you. And then pedestrians and cars were supposed to leave the bridge when the bell rang because they were saying, we're going to open the bridge now, get off. Once clear, the bridge would then swing open and allow the ship to pass. But I am reliably informed that the children never actually managed to remain on the bridge while open, but because they were always spotted and shooed back onto the quay. But I thought that was quite interesting that the swing bridge stands on the site of this original medieval bridge that was washed away, and it did have this little role to play in the folk life of Newcastle, which is quite cool, and also Gateshead as well. But our final disaster is the 1854 fire, and it is important at this point to note, and I have mentioned Gateshead a couple of times, but it's important to note that Newcastle has always had quite a tight trading relationship with its closest neighbour, which is Gateshead, and Gateshead clings to the banks of the Tyne opposite the quayside area of Newcastle, so they're literally looking at each other. And in the 1850s, the Gateshead side was crammed with warehouses, factories and tenements. And this particular block of buildings stretched from the river up to St Mary's Church, and it was bisected by Hillgate, which ran parallel with the river. If you've ever walked along to the Baltic Art Gallery from the Tyne Bridge, you've probably walked along what remains of Hillgate. On 6th of October 1854, a fire broke out in a worsted factory in this particular block of buildings near the end of the previous Tyne Bridge. So this is the stone one, not the one that you'd see on the Great North Run. And the funny thing is, a fire had destroyed this particular factory on the same site 3 years earlier, so clearly nobody learned anything from that. But people rushed to the scene when the alarm was raised and firemen attempted to bring the fire under control. They failed, and the building was destroyed within 2 hours. The problem was the neighbouring premises stored sulphur, lead and tallow, and flames soon swallowed the building. The heat from the original fire caused the sulphur to melt, and then that spread the fire to the combustible material stored in the warehouse. So the entire warehouse then caught fire, all 80 feet and 7 stories of it. So that's quite a lot of combustible material now all on fire. Spectators gathered on the quays, on boats, and even on the new high-level bridge to watch the fire. The high-level bridge is the double-decker bridge that we've got, which does road traffic on the lower deck and carries trains on the top deck. And you can also walk along as well, so there's a pedestrian walkway. Now it's more famous in terms of folk tradition because people will insist on leaving those love locks on it, but the panels get removed periodically and new ones put up. But anyway, people were standing on this bridge, and I think in terms of folk tradition, the images that often remain from the fire are people clustered on the bridge, jostling for the best view of the fire. Things clearly don't change. I think the only thing that would be different if this would happen now is all of those people would be holding up smartphones. But things got worse because an explosion in the warehouse destroyed a collection of houses, mills and warehouses on the Gateside side of the Tyne, and the explosion was so violent that miners in the Weymouth colliery some 11 miles away heard it. Even people in Hartlepool some 40 miles to the south heard the explosion. Surprisingly, rather than running to safety, many of the spectators actually turned their attention towards rescuing the dying or helping the injured. But the explosion also threw burning debris across to the Newcastle side of the river, where it set fire to the shops, offices and warehouses along the quayside. And this caused devastation as far up the hill as Butcherbank, where we now find All Saints Church, and Pilgrim Street. The fire spread to a furniture warehouse and a paper warehouse, where it gleefully gorged itself on the fuel within. And if you want to get an idea again of the force of the blast, a stone weighing 8 kilograms fell through the roof of an optician's on Grey Street, and it was actually still too hot to handle when workmen arrived later that day. A writer called J.R., doesn't have a surname as far as I can gather, wrote about it, describing the scene thus, and I quote, "The ancient pile of St Mary's Church from its elevated site bordering the prospect on the south, and the lofty modern spire of All Saints skirting the view on the north, while the elements of nature were at rest and all was calm, the river unrippled by a wave, the atmosphere scarce ruffled by a breath, and the moon in full orbed brightness, veiled by the immediate density of the conflagration, shedding its pale and silvery light on the distant margin of the scene." End quote. His publication from 1855 is really useful to give like an eyewitness account of what actually happened. But also, unlike Sir Thomas Bloodworth, who was widely and rightfully criticised for his total inaction during the Great Fire of London, the mayors of Gateshead and Newcastle threw themselves, quite literally, into the firefighting efforts. And Gateshead Mayor D. Haggie was in the thick of the action, directing the work. At one point, he was apparently so engrossed in what he was doing, he almost ended up being hit by some falling rubble. While Newcastle Mayor Ralph Dodd seemed to be everywhere at once, so intent was he on helping to direct the firefighting efforts. Durham, Hexham, Carlisle, Morpeth, Berwick, Shields and Sunderland all sent fire engines and other help, and the proximity to the river meant that they actually finally brought the fire under control by nightfall because they at least had a steady supply of water right there in the form of the River Tyne. Few houses in the middle and lower parts of Newcastle remained undamaged, and windows were actually blown out as far away as Market Street and Clayton Street West. Now, I actually checked this on Google Maps, because of course I did, but Market Street is around 790 metres away from Gateshead, and Clayton Street West is 1 kilometre. So again, that shows how violent the explosion must have been, that it blew windows out 1 kilometre away. The Moot Hall bore damage, although it is quite noticeable that the Castle Keep seems to be the only one that didn't really take a lot of damage, but that was a proper medieval castle with really thick walls that was designed to withstand all kinds of things that might be thrown at it, so it kind of just surveyed the scene instead of being particularly damaged. On the Gateshead side of the river, most of the area around the warehouses was completely destroyed. In total, though, 35 people died in Gateshead and 15 people died in Newcastle, including Alexander Dobson, the son of famed city architect John Dobson, although over 200 people were injured. Estimates valued the property destroyed at more than £1 million. Those estimates were made in 1856, and I worked out that that would be around £80 million in 2017. The loss of poor quality housing, though, did lead to the regeneration of the area on the Newcastle side, with Lombard Street, Queen Street and King Street replacing some of the densely packed and highly unsanitary buildings. What does sicken me, however, is the fact that around 20,000 people travelled to the scene, and while some came to offer comfort to the injured or bereaved, most people just came to see the devastation. So again, people clearly don't change. What is fascinating is how few people realise that this ever even happened. It just doesn't seem to be something that's really spoken about, as the plague and the flood aren't. And it did have such a massive impact on the built environment, particularly on the quayside on both sides of the river. You would think that there would have been some mention beyond a blue plaque about it, but there we go. Now, the city had suffered fires, floods and disease outbreaks before and obviously after these disasters, but these three in particular stand out as being worse and more impactful than the others. And like I say, they don't figure as widely in the city's legends or folklore as you would imagine, as if they're disasters the city was keen to forget. Indeed, many likely don't even realise the size or scale of them, if they're even aware they happened at all. Yet each of them went on to influence something else, leaving a trace either in the city's spiritual life or the built environment. So the devastation of the plague likely fanned the flames of paranoia, something that was further stoked by the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, previously known as the English Civil Wars. The main reason why historians call it the Wars of the Three Kingdoms and not the English Civil War is just to take into account the fact it did involve England, Scotland and Ireland, not just England. But anyway, that's just a side issue. Because of all of this that had been going on, people wanted someone to blame for everything faced by the city, so who better to blame than witches? Thus we had the 1650 witch trial panic. However, when we look at the flood and the fire, they both impacted the built environment, and in both cases, older structures that were probably no longer fit for purpose broke down in the face of disasters, both natural and man-made, to be replaced by more solid, contemporary and, importantly, sanitary structures. While housing did eventually return to the quayside, it is still largely a commercial space dominated by offices and bars. But it's by engaging with the people involved that we can better connect with a sense of place. And like I said at the beginning, folklore is very much about that sense of place and being rooted in place, just as local history is. So we have the friends sitting with their dying neighbours during the plague outbreak or rushing to help the injured people during the fire. And we also have the ferryman on the bridge replacement ferry who would, and I quote, not move 1 foot beyond the rules of his own authority or mitigate the sentences passed upon those who are condemned to travel in a stagecoach within a ferry boat, end quote. I think we've all met quite officious people like that who will not do anything that's basically outside of their explicit job description, even if it's to help other people. But these people are the ones that I think help us to understand these disasters, because they're largely ordinary people and we can imagine ourselves in these scenarios, probably the plague scenario better than we'd like to, and we can then reach back through history to these individuals who came before us. And what is that if not a form of urban folklore, where the stories of these disasters have then helped us to remember what actually happened? So I would like to know what you can find out about your city. Please do feel free to let me know. Let me know if you've never heard of any of these disasters in Newcastle before. Feel free to let me know if there's anything notable in the history of where you live or where you're from, whichever, it's up to you. Obviously, people don't always necessarily live in the city in which they were born. And yeah, I just think it's quite interesting, as I say, to have a look at how these things continue and what we can learn from them. Next week, we are, as I say, going to have a look at the Bladen races, which has a song attached to it. I'm highly likely that I won't sing it because nobody needs that, but we'll see. And it's very, very, very heavily part of Northeast tradition even now. So that's quite cool. And it makes a complete change of pace from all of this death and destruction from this particular episode. So the Bladen race is very, very different, but like a lot of the stuff to do with the town moor and the hoppings, which, as I say, I've covered before, very much part of the folk calendar in a way of the year. So hopefully you'll enjoy that as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I realise it's a bit longer than usual, but that's just because obviously there was a fair bit to pack into it and I didn't want to split it across multiple episodes. And I hope it has inspired you to go and have a look at your city's local history. Good places to start for that would be your local library. If you have access to British newspaper archives, if you are obviously in Britain and Ireland, that's quite a good place to start. If you're not, there'll be newspaper archives for your own cities, wherever you happen to be. And see if there's any like image archives online. I'm quite fortunate in that Newcastle libraries have a lot of images on Flickr, which are quite helpful, that you can then have a look through and see what's gone on and what have you. And I think it's just quite interesting because it gives you a different perspective on where it is that you live. So please do feel free to let me know what you find out, and I'll see you next week when we go and have a look at the blading races. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. I don't get paid per play of the podcast like musicians do, so if you'd like to support the podcast so I can keep it ad-free and help me pay for all the annoying stuff like web hosting and cover the hours it takes me to make these episodes, then you can buy me a coffee on Ko-fi or become a member of the Fabulous Folklore family by becoming a paid supporter on Ko-fi, Patreon and Substack. Or you can leave a review, tell a friend, or share episodes on social media for free. It all helps.